The old brown sedan sputtered, coughed a plume of gray smoke, and died. Naomi's hands tightened on the steering wheel, a familiar wave of helpless frustration washing over her. Of all the times, of all the places. The engine gave a final, pathetic shudder before falling into a dead silence, broken only by the hiss of the evening traffic on the adjacent highway. She was already 10 minutes late for her shift at the diner, and this stretch of desolate access road offered no solace. Just cracked asphalt, overgrown weeds, and the deepening twilight. She tried the ignition again. Nothing. Just a defeated click. With a sigh that carried the weight of a dozen other small, relentless struggles, she rested her forehead against the cool plastic of the wheel. Another tow truck bill she couldn't afford. Another lecture from her manager. The universe, it seemed, had a cruel sense of humor. That's when the world behind her went dark. A shadow fell over her small car, so vast and complete it felt like a personal eclipse. In her rearview mirror, she saw not one, but three immaculate black sedans, their tinted windows like obsidian mirrors, gliding to a silent, synchronized stop. They were the kind of cars that didn't belong on roads like this. They belonged in movies, carrying men whose names were spoken in whispers. A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. This was worse than a breakdown. This was trouble. The door of the lead car opened, and a man emerged. He moved with an unnerving grace, his form silhouetted against the blinding headlights. He wore a suit so perfectly tailored it seemed molded to him, a dark gray that absorbed the last of the light. As he approached, his features came into focus. Sharp, intelligent eyes, a strong jaw, and an expression of calm, impenetrable authority. He stopped beside her driver's side window, his presence alone making the air feel thicker, charged with an unspoken power. Naomi held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. He simply looked at her, his gaze sweeping over her worn-out car, her faded uniform of a white shirt and red apron, and finally, her face. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a quiet, unnerving assessment. The man tapped lightly on her window, the sound sharp in the sudden quiet. Naomi flinched but slowly, cautiously, rolled it down a few inches. The air that entered the car was cool, carrying the scent of expensive cologne and something else, something metallic and clean, like rain on steel. "You have a problem," he stated, his voice a low, smooth baritone with an accent she couldn't quite place. It wasn't a question. It was an observation of an undeniable fact, delivered with the same finality as a judge's verdict. "My car," she managed, her own voice sounding thin and reedy. "It won't start," he nodded once, a small, precise movement. His gaze lingered on her face for a moment longer than necessary, a flicker of something unreadable in their dark depths. It wasn't threatening, not exactly. It was searching, as if he were trying to place a half-forgotten melody. He turned and gestured to one of the men who had emerged from the other cars, a silent command that was instantly obeyed. "Pop the hood," he said to her, his attention already shifting to the task at hand. Hesitantly, Naomi pulled the latch. The man walked to the front of her car, the pristine fabric of his suit jacket pulling taut across his broad shoulders as he leaned over the smoking engine. He took off his jacket, folded it with an almost reverent precision, and handed it to his subordinate without looking. Then, he rolled up the sleeves of his crisp white shirt, revealing forearms corded with lean muscle and intricate tattoos that snaked from his wrists to his elbows. It was a startling contrast. The brutal ink against the immaculate shirt, the powerful executive suddenly looking like a mechanic. He peered into the engine bay, his focus absolute. Naomi watched, mesmerized and terrified in equal measure. This man commanded other men with a flick of his wrist, yet here he was, about to put his hands on her greasy, failing engine. He pointed at something inside. "Try it now," she turned the key. The engine choked, sputtered but didn't catch. He didn't seem discouraged. He simply leaned back in, his movements economical and sure. He worked in a focused silence, his brow furrowed in concentration. After a few minutes of tinkering, a smudge of grease appeared on his cheekbone, a stark imperfection against his flawless skin. He seemed utterly oblivious to it. He wiped his hands on a silk handkerchief he pulled from his pocket, staining the fine fabric black without a second thought. "Again," he commanded. She twisted the key, and this time, with a roar and a shudder, The engine turned over. It wasn't a healthy sound, but it was alive. Relief, so potent it made her dizzy, flooded through her. "Thank you," she breathed, looking at him through the windshield. "I don't know how to thank you." He walked back to her window, his expression still neutral, but those searching eyes were on her again. "Your name," he said, the words more a demand than a question. "It's Naomi." The name fell into the space between them, and something profound shifted in his face. His carefully constructed composure fractured for a split second. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly, the cool authority replaced by a flash of raw, unguarded shock. It was as if she hadn't just given him her name, but a key to a locked room in his memory. He stared at her, truly seeing her now, the shape of her eyes, the curve of her smile, the light that had always been there. He knew that light. He remembered it from a lifetime ago, a forgotten promise made under a summer sky. He straightened up abruptly, his mask of control slamming back into place, but the crack had been visible. "Get to where you're going," he said, his voice now strained tight. Before it dies again, and without another word, he turned, walked back to his car, and was gone, leaving Naomi sitting in her rumbling, miraculously resurrected car, the scent of his cologne lingering in the air, her heart pounding with a confusion that went far beyond a simple roadside rescue. The diner was a cacophony of clattering plates, sizzling grease, and the low hum of conversation. Naomi moved through it on autopilot, her body going through the familiar motions of taking orders, refilling coffee cups, and delivering plates of pancakes and fries. But her mind was miles away, stuck on that desolate access road, replaying the bizarre encounter. The man's face was seared into her memory, the intensity of his gaze, the smudge of grease on his cheek, and that shocking moment of recognition when she'd said her name. Who was he? And why had he looked at her like he was seeing a ghost? She was wiping down the counter when her manager, a perpetually stressed man named Sal, grunted in her direction. "You're quiet tonight, Naomi. Everything okay?" She forced a small smile. "Just tired, Sal." "Long day," he nodded, already distracted by a backed-up ticket order. She was grateful for the reprieve. How could she possibly explain it? That a man who looked like he owned half the city, flanked by silent bodyguards, had stopped to fix her beater car with his bare hands? It sounded like a scene from a movie, not a Tuesday night in her life. The bell above the door chimed, and she looked up, her practiced "Welcome to Sal's" dying on her lips. It was him. He stood in the doorway, his imposing frame seeming to shrink the cozy, cluttered space of the diner. He had changed out of the gray suit and into dark trousers and a simple black cashmere sweater that did nothing to soften his formidable presence. His men were nowhere in sight. He was alone, and somehow that was even more intimidating. His eyes scanned the room, bypassing the other customers, the worn linoleum floors, the kitschy decor, and landed directly on her. He held her gaze for a beat, then walked over to the counter and slid onto one of the cracked vinyl stools, moving with the same fluid confidence she'd seen on the roadside. The handful of other patrons seemed to shrink in on themselves, sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere. A nervous silence fell over the counter section. "Coffee," he said, his voice low and steady, pulling her out of her stupor. Black, her hands trembled slightly as she reached for a clean mug. She could feel his eyes on her, watching her every move. She filled the cup, the dark liquid sloshing over the rim, and set it down in front of him, her fingers brushing his for a fraction of a second. A jolt, like static electricity, shot up her arm. She pulled back as if burned. He didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he gave no sign. He simply wrapped his long fingers around the warm ceramic, his gaze never leaving her face. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. He was waiting for her to speak, she realized. But what could she say? "Thank you for fixing my car? Who are you? Why did you look at me like you knew me?" The questions swirled in her head, a chaotic storm of fear and an even more unsettling flicker of curiosity. He took a slow sip of the coffee, his expression unreadable. "This is where you work," he observed, his gaze sweeping over the diner again, this time with a more discerning eye. He noted the faded paint, the slightly sticky counters, the warm, honest smell of fried food and cheap coffee. It was a world away from his own, a universe of polished marble, hushed meetings, and the cold, clean scent of power. It's a job, Naomi replied, her voice more defensive than she intended. She started wiping the counter again, needing something to do with her hands. It pays the bills. Mostly, his eyes softened, just a fraction. You always worked hard. The words hung in the air between them, casual but loaded with a history she couldn't access. I'm sorry, she said, finally looking at him directly, her brow furrowed in confusion. Do I know you? A shadow of something, regret, perhaps, or a deep, old sadness, crossed his face. You did. A long time ago. We were kids, he paused, letting the information settle. My name is Jinwoo. The name meant nothing to her. She searched her memory, trying to connect this powerful, dangerous-looking man to any boy from her childhood. She came up with nothing. She must have looked as lost as she felt, because a faint, melancholy smile touched his lips. It was only for a year. My father was stationed here. We lived in the small blue house at the end of Maple Street. The name was a key, unlocking a dusty, forgotten corner of her mind. The blue house. A quiet, serious boy with dark eyes who had moved in from another country. A boy who didn't speak much English at first, who sat alone at recess. A boy she had shared her lunch with, teaching him the names of her favorite cartoon characters. Jinwoo. Little Jinwoo, who had cried the day his family moved away, making her promise she would never forget him. Oh my God, she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. The memories came flooding back in a rush of disjointed images, building a wobbly fort out of cardboard boxes, sharing a single popsicle on a hot summer day, his small hand in hers as they crossed the street. He had been her first friend, her closest confidant for one brief, sun-drenched year before he had vanished from her life as suddenly as he had appeared. And now he was here, a stranger in a man's body, sitting in her diner, looking at her with the same serious, watchful eyes she now remembered from all those years ago. The world tilted on its axis. The intimidating Mafia boss in the cashmere sweater dissolved, and for a fleeting moment, all she could see was the lonely little boy she had befriended. The shock rendered her speechless. Jinwoo seemed to understand, giving her the space she needed to process the impossible truth. He nursed his coffee, his gaze gentle now, patient. He had watched her from a distance for days, ever since that night on the road. After leaving her, he had driven back to his sterile penthouse overlooking the city, the name, Naomi, echoing in his mind. He had summoned his right-hand man, Minjun, and given him a simple, urgent task: find out everything about the woman with the broken-down car. The file had been on his desk by morning. Naomi Evans, 23 years old, orphaned at 16, working 2 jobs to make ends meet, living in a tiny apartment above a laundromat. No family to speak of, no safety net, just a quiet life of relentless, dignified struggle. And a photograph from a school yearbook, a smiling girl with bright, hopeful eyes. His Naomi. The girl who had shared her crayons with him when he had none, who had defended him from bullies who made fun of his accent, who had made a strange, lonely country feel like home for a little while. The weight of the intervening years pressed down on him. While she had been fighting to survive, he had been dragged back to Korea and forged into the air of a powerful, ruthless organization. He had learned to be cold, to be calculating, to build walls of power and fear around himself so that no one could ever touch him. He had become a man she would never and should never know. Yet here he was. He had told himself it was just curiosity, a loose end from his past that needed to be tied. But as he sat there, watching the play of emotions on her face, disbelief, confusion, and then a flicker of dawning recognition, he knew it was more than that. It was a pull, an undeniable magnetic force drawing him back to the only time in his life he had ever felt genuinely safe, genuinely seen. I can't believe it's you, Naomi finally said, her voice barely a whisper. You look so different. He allowed himself another small, sad smile. We were 8 years old, Naomi. A lot has changed, an understatement of epic proportions. What are you doing here? Back in this city, she asked, her curiosity overriding her caution. Business, he said, the single word a neat, tidy box for a world of violence and shadows. My trip was extended. I didn't expect to. I didn't know you were still here. It was a lie, of course. He had known exactly where she was for the past week. but he couldn't tell her that. He couldn't tell her that he'd had his men watch over her from a distance, ensuring she got to and from work safely, that her car was discreetly replaced with a reliable, newer model that had appeared in her apartment's parking spot with an anonymous note saying it was a lottery win. He couldn't tell her that seeing her again had shaken the foundations of the life he had so carefully constructed. So he sat there, a king in a world of shadows, feeling more powerless than he had in years, simply hoping she wouldn't tell him to leave. Naomi fell into a new, strange rhythm. Every night, around 10 o'clock, Jin-woo would walk into the diner. He would take the same stool at the counter, order a black coffee, and simply sit there. He never stayed for more than an hour. He rarely spoke unless she spoke first. He just watched, a quiet, formidable guardian in her small, brightly lit world. At first, it was unnerving. The other regulars gave him a wide berth, and even Sal stopped trying to make small talk with him after a few failed attempts. But slowly, Naomi grew accustomed to his presence. It became a silent, comforting punctuation mark at the end of her long shifts. She found herself looking for his car through the window, a small, secret flutter of anticipation in her chest when the sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb. They started to talk more, their conversations like building a fragile bridge across the vast chasm of their two lives. She told him about her dream of opening a small bakery someday, a place that smelled of cinnamon and warm bread, a place that was all her own. She spoke of her love for creating things with her hands, of the simple joy of seeing someone's face light up after tasting a pastry she'd made. He listened with an unnerving intensity, his dark eyes never leaving her face, making her feel as though her small, simple dream was the most important thing in the world. He, in turn, told her about his life in carefully curated snippets. He spoke of Seoul, of the relentless pace of his work, of the crushing weight of family expectations. He painted a picture of a successful but lonely businessman, a man trapped in a gilded cage. He never mentioned the violence, the fear he commanded, the blood that stained the money he earned. He gave her an edited version of himself, the only version he felt she could ever accept. One rainy Tuesday, the diner was nearly empty. Jin-woo was nursing his coffee when Naomi slid a small plate across the counter toward him. On it was a perfectly golden apple turnover, steam still rising from the flaky crust. "I was experimenting," she said, a shy smile on her face. "You're my guinea pig." He looked from the pastry to her face, a flicker of genuine surprise in his eyes. No one had given him something they had made with their own hands in years. Everything in his life was bought, negotiated, or taken. He picked it up, the warmth seeping into his fingers, and took a bite. The pastry was light and buttery, the apple filling sweet and spiced with cinnamon. It tasted of warmth, of care, of home. A feeling so foreign, it almost brought him to his knees. He closed his eyes for a moment, savoring it. "It's good," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. "It's the best thing I've ever tasted," she beamed, a radiant, unguarded smile that lit up her whole face, and in that moment, Jin-woo knew, with a terrifying certainty, that he was in far deeper than he had ever intended to be. The fragile peace of their nightly routine was shattered on a Friday. The diner was busier than usual, filled with the boisterous energy of the weekend crowd. Naomi was rushing between tables, her tray laden with burgers and milkshakes, when a group of men walked in. They were loud, dressed in flashy suits, and moved with a swagger that instantly put everyone on edge. They were not the diner's usual clientele. They took a large booth in the back, their eyes scanning the room with a predatory arrogance. Naomi's stomach twisted. She saw Jin-woo, sitting at his usual spot at the counter, tense. His back was ramrod straight, his hand resting on the coffee mug but not lifting it. His eyes were fixed on the men, his face a mask of cold fury. One of the men, clearly the leader, spotted Jin-woo. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He said something to his companions, and they all laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. The leader then stood up and started walking toward the counter, his path taking him directly past the station where Naomi was refilling salt shakers. As he passed, he deliberately bumped into her, hard. The shakers went flying, salt scattering across the floor like snow. "Watch where you're going, sweetheart," he sneered, his eyes raking over her in a way that made her skin crawl. Before she could even react, Jinwoo was on his feet. He moved with a silent, lethal speed that was terrifying to behold. One moment he was at the counter, the next he was standing between Naomi and the other man, his body a solid, immovable wall. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The sheer menace radiating from him was suffocating. His eyes, now chips of black ice, locked onto the other man. "You have a problem," Jinwoo said, his voice dangerously soft, echoing the first words he had ever spoken to Naomi. The man's sneer faltered. He clearly recognized Jinwoo, and the color drained from his face. Fear, stark and primal, replaced his earlier arrogance. He stammered an apology, his eyes darting around nervously. We were just leaving." He practically scrambled back to his booth, herding his bewildered men out of the diner, without another word. The entire restaurant was dead silent, every eye fixed on Jinwoo. He stood there for a moment longer, his chest rising and falling, a tightly coiled spring of violence. Then he seemed to force himself to relax. He turned to Naomi, his expression softening as he looked at her, but she could still see the storm raging behind his eyes. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low. She could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. The protective barrier he had erected was also a cage, and for the first time, she saw the real danger that surrounded him. He wasn't just a lonely businessman. He was something else, something powerful and terrifying. He looked around at the staring faces, then back at her. "I should go," he said, his voice strained. He placed a few bills on the counter and walked out, leaving a profound and chilling silence in his wake. For the next 3 nights, he didn't come. The diner felt empty, the silence at the counter louder than any conversation. Naomi found herself watching the door, a knot of dread and a deeper, more confusing ache in her chest. She was terrified of what she had seen, but she was even more terrified that he was gone for good. The silence from Jinwoo stretched into a week. Every night, the stool at the counter remained empty, a void in the fabric of her routine. The fear from that Friday night had subsided, replaced by a hollow, persistent ache. She missed him. She missed his quiet presence, his intense gaze, the low timbre of his voice. She missed the man, not the monster she had glimpsed. She found herself replaying their conversations, remembering the way his eyes would soften when she talked about her bakery, the rare, sad smile that would touch his lips. She was beginning to understand that the cold, dangerous man and the lonely, gentle one were 2 sides of the same person, and the realization didn't scare her as much as it saddened her. She was leaving work late one evening, the streetlights casting long shadows on the damp pavement, when a familiar black car pulled up to the curb beside her. The back door opened, and Jinwoo looked out at her, his face pale and drawn in the dim light. "Get in, Naomi," he said. It wasn't a request. She hesitated for only a second before sliding into the plush leather interior. The car was silent as it drove, gliding through the sleeping city. He didn't tell her where they were going, and she didn't ask. She simply watched the city lights blur past, the tension in the small space between them a living thing. The car finally came to a stop at a scenic overlook, a place where the entire glittering expanse of a city was spread out before them like a carpet of fallen stars. Jinwoo killed the engine, plunging them into a quiet intimacy. "I'm sorry," he began, his voice raspy, "for what happened at the diner. For scaring you." "Who are you, Jinwoo?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. The truth, he was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the city below. The city he commanded, the city that was his kingdom and his prison. "The boy you knew is gone," he said finally, his voice heavy with a resignation that broke her heart. "He was lost a long time ago. My family, our business, it's not the kind you read about in financial papers. It's old, it's complicated, and it's violent. That man in the diner, he is my rival, my enemy. By seeing me with you, he saw a weakness, a target." He turned to face her, his eyes filled with a raw, desperate vulnerability she had never seen before. "I put you in danger, Naomi, just by sitting in your diner, just by being near you. I should have stayed away. From the moment I recognized you on that road, I should have driven away and never looked back. But I couldn't." He reached out, his hand hovering in the air between them for a moment before he gently, tentatively, cupped her cheek. His thumb stroked her skin, his touch both a plea and a confession. "You are the only real thing in my life," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. "Everything else is strategy and power and survival. But you taste like cinnamon and hope. And I am so selfish that I couldn't stay away from that, even if it meant putting you at risk." The confession hung in the air, stripped of all pretense. It was the truth, ugly and beautiful all at once. It was the story of a lost boy trapped inside a dangerous man, reaching for the one memory of light he had ever known. Naomi looked at him, at the man who held the city in his fist but whose hand trembled as it touched her face. She saw the immense loneliness in his eyes, a cavern so deep she felt she could fall into it. The fear she had felt was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a wave of profound empathy. He wasn't a monster. He was a product of a world she couldn't imagine, a man shaped by duty and violence, who still remembered what it felt like to be a little boy sharing a popsicle on a summer afternoon. She saw the sacrifice in his confession. He was offering her an escape, laying bare the danger he represented, so she could run from it. He was telling her she should be afraid of him, but as she looked at him, all she could see was the boy who had protected her from bullies on the playground, now grown into a man who had stood between her and a threat in the diner. The method was different, the stakes infinitely higher, but the instinct was the same. She raised her hand and placed it over his, pressing his palm more firmly against her cheek. "I was scared," she admitted, her voice soft but steady. "But I was more scared when you didn't come back." His breath hitched. His carefully constructed walls, the ones that had taken a lifetime to build, crumbled into dust. He had expected her to recoil, to demand he let her out of the car, to look at him with the same fear and disgust everyone else did. He had not expected this quiet, courageous acceptance. "You don't understand, Naomi," he choked out. "The world I live in, it will devour someone like you. It will stain you." "Maybe," she said, her gaze unwavering. "Or maybe I can bring a little bit of my world into yours." It was a reckless, foolish thing to say, born of emotion rather than logic. But it was the truest thing she had ever said. She didn't want his power or his money. She wanted the man who looked at her like she was a miracle, the man who remembered a promise made by children. Jin-woo leaned in, his forehead coming to rest against hers. He breathed her in, the simple, clean scent of her, a stark contrast to the metallic tang of blood and fear that usually clung to him. For the first time in over a decade, he felt a flicker of peace. He felt home. "I don't deserve you," he whispered, a broken prayer against her skin. "You probably don't," she replied, a small, watery smile touching her lips. "But you found me anyway." He closed the small distance between them and kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of passion or demand, but one of profound, aching tenderness. It was a kiss that tasted of desperation and relief, of years of loneliness and the fragile, terrifying hope of a new beginning. It was the meeting of two worlds, not with a clash, but with a quiet, reverent surrender. In the silence of the car, high above the glittering, oblivious city, a lost boy finally found his way back. 6 months later, the air smelled not of expensive cologne or diner grease, but of yeast, sugar, and melting butter. The late morning sun streamed through the large front window of Naomi's Needs, illuminating the motes of flour that danced in the light. The bakery was small, intimate, with warm wooden tables and the gentle hum of a cooling rack full of fresh croissants. It was her dream, realized in brick and mortar. Naomi, her hands dusted with flour, was kneading a large ball of dough on a marble countertop, her movements rhythmic and practiced. She was so focused on her work that she didn't hear the bell above the door jingle. A pair of strong arms wrapped around her waist from behind, and a familiar chin rested on her shoulder. "It smells incredible in here," Jin-woo murmured into her ear, his voice a low rumble that sent a pleasant shiver down her spine. She leaned back against his solid frame, a contented smile on her face. "You're late for your lesson, Mr. Kwan." "This brioche won't knead itself," he chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. He looked different here. The severe suits were gone, replaced by soft jeans and a simple gray t-shirt. The constant tension that had once radiated from him had eased, the hard lines around his eyes and mouth softened. He was still formidable, still powerful. That would never change, but in this small, sunlit space, he was just Jin-woo. He reached around her, placing his large hands over hers on the dough. "Show me again," he said. "I'm a slow learner." She guided his hands, showing him how to fold and press, to feel the life in the dough. His touch was still so careful, so tentative, as if he were afraid of breaking something so simple and good. Their life was a delicate balance. His world still existed, a dark shadow at the edges of their new reality. There were still late-night meetings, hushed phone calls, and days when a grimness would settle over him that she couldn't penetrate. But he had built a fortress around her, around their life together. The men who had once been his intimidating guards were now discreet figures who watched the bakery from a distance, ensuring no threat ever crossed its threshold. He had carved out this small pocket of peace and light for them, and he defended it with the same silent ferocity he applied to the rest of his empire. He was learning to live in her world, just as she was learning to accept the existence of his. He loved watching her work, loved the focused, serene expression on her face as she created. He found a peace in the simple, honest labor of it that his own life had never offered. He had bought her this bakery, a grand gesture he had been nervous to make, afraid it would feel like a transaction. But she had accepted it with tears in her eyes, not as a gift of money, but as a gift of faith. He had given her a future, and she, in turn, had given him a present worth living in. As their hands worked the dough together, he turned his head and kissed the side of her neck. "I love you," he whispered, the words no longer feeling foreign or difficult. They felt as natural and essential as breathing. Naomi stopped kneading and turned in his arms to face him, dusting a small smudge of flour on his nose. "I love you, too," she said, her eyes shining. "Even if you are a terrible baker," he smiled, a real, unguarded smile that reached his eyes, and he leaned in to kiss her, the taste of sugar and the promise of a quiet, ordinary life on their lips. Fate had a funny way of working. It had separated two children, sent them down wildly different paths of hardship and power, only to crash them back into each other on a lonely road. It was a second chance neither of them had known they were waiting for, a quiet homecoming for two souls who had long ago promised they would never forget.